right. Well, thanks for the introduction to the Cañete Valley. So now I'm going to present some of the results from our scientific exploration as part of this project. This is going to be a bit more of an academic talk, but I tried to be very light on the mathematics. So this talk is greening and browning trends on the Pacific slope of Peru and northern Chile. And so it might be quite a jump to go from one valley all the way to the entire country and bits of another country as well. And so I want to give a little context as to why we're looking at such a large area. I started by using drones and satellite imagery to monitor the changes of vegetation. And I wanted to see what was happening with mining, for example, or agriculture or urban activities, how that would affect the neighboring vegetation. Would vegetation change? Would it grow? Would it diminish? And I found that vegetation would grow near agricultural sites, would grow near urban activities, and would grow near mines. I thought, this is strange. This goes against what I thought this would be. So I zoomed out a bit, and I saw that in the whole valley, vegetation was growing. I thought, this is strange as well. So I zoomed out more and more and more until I was looking at the whole country, and where we found a whole area of vegetation that's growing as a continuous shape. And so this is quite interesting and had previously not been reported on. So this is a collaborative effort. I did a lot of the data analysis and data gathering, but it's also a team effort. So I did this alongside my colleagues Eustace, Eleanor, Morag, and Crispin, who is the head of the group. So let me start with a bit of a spoiler. I'm going to start with actually the end of the talk. So this is the final result. If you don't want to know, close your eyes. So this is a spoiler of our actual result. Here's an exaggerated view of how high the Andes are. It's a 3D mock-up of Peru. And we can see here this green area is the area that is typically the desert. It's the hot arid desert or a cold arid desert, but now has undergone significant greening. These aren't true colors, but here green represents areas that have increased by a lot in vegetation. And by a lot, I mean 30 to 60% increase in vegetation in the past 20 years. So if anything from my presentation, this slide is the take-home message. This is the one picture that summarizes everything that we've discovered. But I'm going to go into a bit more detail onto what this actually means, how we discovered this, and what kind of correlations we can find with causes as to why this is happening. Let me just outline shortly. We'll talk about the methods, how I quantify vegetation change and how I collected all this data. The study area, what is this area of the Andes, and when I mention hot arid desert, cold arid desert, what do I mean? Then we're going to discuss the results, and we're going to zoom in a little bit more to look at smaller sections where we can understand some of the greening and browning trends. And finally, a discussion with statistical correlations and comparisons to climate factors, which we think influence the growth of vegetation. So let's start off with methods. First of all of the data comes from the MODIS satellite. This is a satellite that's operated by NASA, and it was launched in early 2000 and has been operating continuously since. So we have data going back all the way to early 2000. The spatial coverage is global, so this satellite takes pictures of the entire planet, and we have a revisit time of 16 days. And so every 16 days we get a fresh image of the entire planet. So we can compare the differences every 2 weeks basically on the Earth. And these images have a spatial resolution of 250 meters. It's quite big. So you can't see you couldn't see individual houses, for example, or you couldn't see individual objects. But on the scale of the country as a whole, 250 meters is plenty sufficient. One thing that's nice is that the data is completely freely available, so it's not because we had to pay an enormous sum of money or because we have higher privilege from the universities. Anybody can have access to this data. And the data I use is a vegetation index from a multispectral sensor. So about this last thing, what does it mean? Multispectral. So here might be a familiar slide with the electromagnetic spectrum and the colors of visible light. And so as light rays are more energetic, we're closer to the blue. As light rays are less energetic, we're closer to red. And with normal visible light, we can look at a plant and assess its health a little bit. A plant that's nice with a deep green is quite healthy. A plant that's brown or yellow is not so healthy maybe. However, we can go more than just with that information. We can use infrared light, which is actually more indicative of plant health than just using visible light. What does this look like from the satellite's perspective? Well, the satellite here, this last row here, is our MODIS satellite. And this satellite has upwards of 30 sensors. And each sensor will capture a different frequency of light. And so we can use 3 sensors for green light and 3 sensors for red light. And then we have infrared light. And we can do calculations with the information from those sensors and compare the amount of light that's coming into each sensor to see what that corresponds to in terms of vegetation health. Now, how does infrared light tell us how healthy plants are? Well, we can use vegetation indices. So if we look at a healthy tree here, a healthy plant, it will reflect a lot of near-infrared light, and it will actually emit some near-infrared light because of the photosynthetic processes that are going on inside the plant. There will be an emission of near-infrared light. And in the way that photosynthesis works, it will absorb nearly all red light. So light that's shining from the sun is from a broad spectrum, but visible red light will be absorbed by healthy plants, and near-infrared light will be reflected or even emitted. And so if we calculate the difference between these two, we get a number, and here we'll have something like 0.69. In the case of an unhealthy plant, the unhealthy plant might be browner or have some red tones to it, will reflect a lot more visible red light, and will not be producing as much near-infrared. And so if we calculate this difference again, we get a much smaller number. And so this number here is sufficient to give us an assessment of plant's health. Not just plant health, but it can also give us an estimate of plant density. If we're looking at these large images with pixels of 250 meter resolution, we're not looking at individual leaves anymore. We're not even looking at individual trees. We're looking at ensembles of trees. And so we can assess areas that are more or less dense in terms of vegetation. So this index that I present here is called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And the calculation is quite simple. We have near-infrared light minus red light divided by near-infrared light plus red light. But we can use more sophisticated band algebra to get different indices. For example, the Enhanced Vegetation Index is the same near-infrared light minus red light, but now we're including green light, blue light, and some corrective factors for atmospheric conditions and canopy characteristics. We can also do the same with normalized difference water indices to get an estimate of how moist the soil is, or to detect the presence of lagoons or lakes or rivers. So what does this look like when we actually process this information? Here we have a normal satellite image. Over here on the left we have San Vicente de Cañete, and we have the Cañete Valley and more. We can see some of the rainforest in this picture. And if we swap our view over to EVI, so the Enhanced Vegetation Index, we now get a picture that shows us where there's more plant density and where there's less plant density. So obviously here in the rainforest, a very high plant density. We've color-coded this as deep green to indicate that there are loads of plants. Over here, in the red areas, we basically have nothing. There are no plants that grow here, very, very scarce. And in the yellow areas, there is some vegetation, but it's obviously weaker than in the rainforest. And so we have an indication of where plants are accumulated in different areas. And we can see here that despite this area being red, there are pockets of green vegetation. And these, you might be able to guess, but these are agricultural sites. So these are areas that have been artificially enhanced in terms of vegetation density. So this is a nice picture for getting an idea of where plants are and where plants aren't. But if we want to look at the effects of climate change, we need to look at comparisons. So we can compare these two images, an accumulation, an average of the vegetation index from 2000 to 2010, and another average from 2011 to 2022. So we're comparing decades. And now we can play a game of spot the difference between these two images, which might be a little bit difficult because nothing is apparently different, but there are some differences. And so what we do, instead of comparing these in minute details, we'll just subtract the two images and look at the difference. So we can plot just this, and here, this is a new color map, and this shows the changes in vegetation. So these light green areas, they don't necessarily indicate areas with a lot of plants. They only indicate areas with more plants than there were before. Similarly, areas that are red don't indicate areas that have no plants at all. They only indicate areas that have fewer plants than there was 20 years ago. And so this gives us an interesting perspective now in areas that, remember here this was the rainforest, we see large patches of red, and so this is associated to deforestation. And we can see large patches of green or patches of red and green over here associated to agriculture. If we plant a new field, then naturally this will be green because there's new vegetation there. And red areas are urban expansion, where now there are buildings and this has just destroyed the vegetation. So we'll look at this in more details with going through our study area. So yeah, we focus on the west flank of the Andes, and let's look at climate zones. So here we have in the inset a view of South America, and the little shadowed area is the area we decided to focus our study on. And so zoomed in, this is basically the coast of Peru all the way to the eastern side of the Andes. And we can divide this into climate zones. And these have been divided by using the Köppen-Geiger classification system. It's basically a collection of climate factors that will dictate which zone should behave like with which other zone. And so the areas that are most covered by our study area are the cold arid desert, the polar tundra, the hot arid desert, the cold arid steppe, and the tropical savanna. Now, these three are in black, they're boldened, because these are the areas in which we find this greening strip that I revealed in the very first slide. In these areas, there are changes affected by climate, but it's much less clear to see if there's a significant trend or exactly what is happening. So we'll just focus on these three, even though there's some analysis with the others. So what does this mean? What do I mean by the greening strip? Well, if we look at the changes in vegetation in that area over the whole country, we can see that this yellow area, a lot of the vegetation has remained the same, but there's this one continuous feature that just spans the entire Andes here that is very, very green. And this again is 30 to 60% changes, 30 to 60% increases in vegetation. So it's quite a significant increase to happen over 20 years. Normally plants don't grow this quickly, but here we have a very significant increase and a very continuous one. So It's important to note here that not every change is statistically significant. We'll have years with a lot of plants, we'll have dry years, and so year on year it will not necessarily be the same. It's not because today is warmer than yesterday that that's a trend and that every day is going to be warmer than yesterday. This can vary year on year, but we've done a very thorough task. We went through rigorous mathematics to look at only the pixels that were undergoing a statistically significant change. So this is, despite variations year on year, there is a trend where every time things are getting more and more green. So let's look at these results. Let's just have a little legend here. So in these images, dotted outlines, unfortunately you can't see much with this resolution, but some dotted outlines here represent urban areas. The dashed outlines represent mines and quarries, and solid outlines are agricultural sites. Let's zoom into this a little bit more. Starting from the north, from Trujillo down to Huacho, we have that cities, for example, are usually browning. So they have these red colors because the vegetation is decreasing in cities. You've got urban expansion and plants are not being considered as important as buildings. In agricultural areas, you generally have a greening because more plants are being planted or fertilizers are being used to enhance the productivity of plants. And here in mines and quarries, you have browning. Right next to the mines, all the plants have died because, well, either the mine exists, so the ground has just been dug up, or the areas around the ground has been overturned, or the dust has covered everything and plants have died, or the mines have extracted a lot of water from the area, and if plants no longer have groundwater, everything around the mine will die. But these are very local effects around the mine. It's not like they propagate throughout huge extents of land. They're these little blisters that we can spot on the satellite images. Moving further south, including Huaral, Lima, and Cañete, we can see again that the cities have a lot of browning. They're very destructive to vegetation, and mines are also destructive to vegetation. Here we have these circles, the solid circles. They surround mountains. And what's special about those mountains is they're mountains that contain or used to contain ice caps. So there were glaciers on these mountains, and we can see that they are all greening. So there are all more plants on these areas. Why is that? Because the ice has melted. The ice has melted and revealed the ground underneath, and now plants can creep up and grow on these ice caps. So greening is generally seen as a positive thing, and we want more plants, and it seems great, but it's not always the case. We have to be careful here that some greening here is indicative of not the most positive of changes. Let's keep going south here. So looking at Ica and Nazca, here we see that the greening strip is very pronounced. We can see this large extent is greening, and again we highlight mining areas, urban areas, and agricultural areas. And in this particular case, you can see that there are agricultural areas and urban areas that penetrate inside what we call the greening strip. And we've been very careful to eliminate all zones of direct human activity from this greening strip. We don't want to include cities or farms or agricultural sites in our analysis because these are too directly controlled by humans. We can just add fertilizers or irrigate a land and that will cause it to green. So the area that I call the greening strip is only natural vegetation. This is not affected by direct human impact. Moving south again, we've got Arequipa and Moquegua. Here is where the greening strip is the strongest, where there's been the most increase in vegetation. Again, agricultural sites show greening and browning depending on if new fields have been developed or if old fields have been abandoned. And we can again see the deep greening of mountains that had ice caps on them. Arequipa is in the middle of this. We've eliminated everything that counts as the Arequipa area from our analysis to not bias our numbers on what we qualify as greening. Finally, moving down to the end, we've got Tacna and into Chile. And so here the greening strip dissipates a little bit and finally tapers off to end in northern Chile. So I can show you some images on the ground because we've been to see what this actually looks like. And so we have images of the greening areas that are indeed quite green. Now again, this doesn't mean that this didn't exist 20 years ago. It just means that there's been a 30 to 60% increase. So these images are recent images and they show the current state of the greening strip. And this is an increase relative to what there was before. And similarly, there are areas outside the greening strip that are browning. So we have areas where there was more lush vegetation, and that vegetation has deteriorated in some way. So let's discuss a few correlations and a few climate factors to try to understand what is this greening strip, how does it behave. So first of all, we correlate the greening strip with elevation. So going from north to south here, we look at where the greening strip is located on the mountains, on the Andes. And starting all the way in the north in Trujillo, we can see that the greening strip begins at a few hundred meters and rises up to about 2,000 meters. And as we move south, the lowest point of the greening strip moves up and up and up and up the mountains, and so does the highest point, to the point where here in Chile, we have that the greening strip starts at about 2,500 meters and goes all the way up to 5,000 meters. And so this is interesting. It's interesting that the greening strip would not be at an equal position on the mountains, at an equal altitude. It's also interesting that the trend would go that way. Because in the southern hemisphere, as we progress south, we would expect temperatures to get colder. And as we go up the mountain, we would expect temperatures to get colder. And so if anything, I would have expected the trend to be the other way. Because you think in the north where the temperatures are higher, we can go higher up in the mountains, and in the south where the temperatures are colder, we'd have to be lower to keep that same temperature. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. So this is an odd observation. And if we go back to our climate zones, the three climate zones that lie in or where the greening strip is, the hot arid desert, the cold arid desert, and the hot arid steppe, also behave this way. So the climate also goes up the mountain as we progress south. So this is interesting. However, more than the climate zones, this greening strip traverses climate zones. So it seems like it's not bound to one single climate zone. In the north, it starts in one, crosses all three to end in the third one in the south. And so I would think that this is evidence that the climate zones need to change. The way they were defined is no longer accurate because the climate has changed in that area and the plants are reacting to that. The plants are growing in these areas that are now favorable for them, and this is an indication that the climate zones have shifted. So let's go back to this 3D image. With this information in mind, we can clearly see that over here in the north, the greening is almost at the coast here. We can see some greening all throughout the mountains, not so high. And as we go south, we can see here that where the greening begins goes up and up and up higher into the Andes. And so it's an interesting observation. So it doesn't seem like equal temperature has been a factor for determining where this greening occurs. So we can correlate this to different climate factors. So we think, what do plants want? What do plants grow on? Well, we'll look at precipitation. We'll look at the neighboring sea surface temperature to have an estimate of water evaporation from the sea. And we'll look at atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And so precipitation is obviously important to plants because they thrive on water. And here we can see that the correlation, so the greening inside the strip is the green line here. And the blue line, which unfortunately is a bit hard to see, but the blue line is the amount of precipitation. And we can see that if the precipitation dips, so does vegetation. And so there is a correlation here. There are 3 dips in precipitation, and about 2 weeks later, there are 3 dips in vegetation. In the same way, if there's a spike in precipitation, there's also a spike in plant growth. When we look at sea surface temperature, it doesn't seem so correlated, so it's hard to see by eye what's happening. And with CO2, CO2 is diffuse through the atmosphere, so there's a lot less variation with that. But again, it's a bit hard for us to compare, but we can use mathematics and we can use correlation functions to get a quantifiable number to see what correlates best with our vegetation growth. So in this table here, we can compare the correlation factor with each climate zone and the greening strip itself. And we can see that in every case, global CO2 seems to be the most highly correlated factor. And so plants are responding to an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration with all of the emissions and all of the carbon emissions that we're doing everywhere. And this is not just focused on Peru, because if there are carbon emissions anywhere in the world, winds will take them all over the planet. And so this will affect plants everywhere. And so it's not necessarily Peru's emissions, it's the world's emissions that go and increase CO2 concentrations and will be favorable to plant growth. In the same way, precipitation, less correlated than CO2, but is still correlated, so we have a strong plant response to precipitation. And although sea surface temperature didn't seem correlated, it's always positively correlated. A little bit weaker, but always positively correlated with plant growth. So this gives us insights into the drivers of this vegetation growth. It's such a large area that it can't be direct human impact. This is not something that someone has decided to purposefully do. The area spans over 2,000 kilometers in length. This is not a coordinated effort to grow plants, and we've been to some of these places. They're mountains covered in natural vegetation. So this is not a project that has happened this way. This is natural vegetation responding to changes in climate, and some of these changes are seen, most of these changes are seen as global carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, and some are through precipitation, which comes from the warming of the seas that will cause more precipitation, or the melting of glaciers, which will cause more water to become available. So thank you very much for listening. This is actually the scientific article that where you can see everything I've presented here and in a lot more detail, in a lot more mathematical detail. If you scan the QR code, you'll get a link to the actual website with the scientific article. So with that, yeah, thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Really interesting, thank you very much. And of course, the CO2 CO2 fertilisation effect is correlated with the increase in moisture because you're talking about such a hyper-arid area, so that these two things have to kind of happen together for the plants in order to have that moisture budget to exploit the CO2 fertilisation.
Yeah,
I
think
sort of how you're thinking about it.
so. These factors are very hard to interpret because there's a lot of feedback going on, and so it's hard to know if one causes the other, or if they have to happen together, or if they're uncorrelated with each other. Obviously, only increasing CO2 and completely eliminating water would not be conducive to plant growth. Whether the two are absolutely needed hand in hand, I think an increase in CO2 would lead to an increase in plant growth regardless of the water content. But as you say, there is a limit where this is a hyper-arid area, and if there's no water, then no matter how much CO2 you give to a plant, there's a limit to how much it can grow, and that limit will be the bottleneck factor will be the precipitation. So yeah, this is a correct statement. Yes.
Has this been researched in other areas of the world? i.e., are there similar findings elsewhere?
Yeah, so
non-coastal areas, for example.
Yeah. So, well, it's difficult to say if this is actually coastal because we're not so close to the coast here. Like, obviously, it's not so far from the coast, but
more continental areas.
Right, right. So there is consensus that global CO2 has been favorable to plants everywhere. Studies like this, where we notice this large area, have not been done in a lot of areas because there isn't this large extent that is untouched. And so if we look at Europe, for example, it's very hard to look at Europe because everything has been touched by people. And so if there's greening or browning, it doesn't mean much because precipitation doesn't matter for a field if we carefully control the amount of water that plants get there. And so there aren't areas that have undergone things like this. And we have actually looked at other parts of the world as well. Now with our data processing methods, we've looked at other areas. And one would think, for example, in other hyper-arid areas, let's look at the Sahara, for example, this hasn't happened. So there's no...
Australia?
In Australia, it's very variable. So it depends when this would happen, but they have these wildfires that will go and completely annihilate everything. And so some years you'll have this big greening, and some years you'll have an absolute destruction. And so it's hard to see if there's a trend with greening or if it's just a response to everything is burned down the year prior and now there's a regrowth. But this is true. This is something that we're interested in doing and looking at other areas of the world and comparing the growth there to this kind of growth.
Would it be appropriate to mention what one of the reviewers of the first draft said with respect to this and its location?
Which particular?
The reviewer who was that one.
The reviewer that was not so happy, or
well, the one who wondered whether this was actually worthwhile.
Whether it was a significant area. Yes. So when we submitted this, we obviously have it peer reviewed, and we had 4 reviewers get back to us, and they had comments on how we had processed the data, how we had written the paper, and all that. And one of the reviewers had commented, "Why is this paper of interest? Because the area, nobody cares. It's such a small area, nobody cares."
So you had to go back to them and say, well, very much. There's quite a lot of people who care about what's
I don't know if I
here,
agree with that statement here. I'm not sure what to do with that information. And it's not such a small area. The area that we call the greening strip, in terms of area, is larger than the United Kingdom. So if nobody cares about this area, then maybe nobody cares about the UK, but I don't know. I hope it's not, this is not what they meant. Yeah, sorry.
I know you're talking about what's natural, but has all the plantations of asparagus, blueberries, avocado, growth, for instance, in Peru, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Has it had an impact, and do you have any conclusions?
So has the development of agriculture had an impact on this, for example? So I would say no, because we can look at areas with agriculture, for example, here, right? So here we have all along a river where on the banks of the river we have extensive farming. The whole river is covered in agriculture. And we can see this, that it's a recent development here too. We can see this river where there's extensive greening, and if you look at what this thick green line is, it's only agriculture. It's all sorts of fields. But this can't possibly affect the whole area here. It's too small in comparison to the whole area. And even if we look locally, the impact of agriculture on this kind of greening is quite small compared to where the whole greening is. We look at bofedales, for example, these wetland areas in the high Andes. And sometimes when people want to grow potato farms or whatever they want to grow, they will reroute irrigation from the bofedal over to their farm. And this obviously destroys the bofedal because now there's no more water input. It's supposed to be a wetland. Now it's dry, so it dies off. But this will be a very local thing where one stream has been diverted and one bofedal has now dried up. It doesn't explain this vast area, and even if there is a significant agricultural development in Peru, it's nothing compared to the vast area of the greening strip. Yes.
Thank you for an excellent lecture.
Thank you.
Has there been any reaction from the scientific academic communities or the government in Peru and Chile? If so, are there any lessons they could be learning from this?
So this is a very good question, and we're hoping the answer will be yes. It's a very recent publication. So this was published about a month ago, and usually the scientific community takes a little bit of time to pick this up. We were actually contacted by BBC Mundo in South America to write an article about this, and we're hoping that this right here is the first time that I'm presenting this to an audience. So I hope it was well received, and it's my intention that when we go on field trips in Peru, I will present this again. I will present this research and hopefully generate collaborations or generate interest in this, and have people participate in this kind of scientific research to see what the impacts of this greening could be, because we can state it, we can see that it's there, but then if we just say, okay, well, we don't care, then fine. But a change like this, a vegetation change of 30 to 60%, affects an ecosystem. And ecosystems are delicate balances. And so the thing that we don't mention here, because it's very difficult to go and count the plants, is what has increased. Is it just a general increase where everything has increased? Or is it one type of plant that's just better at growing that's going to overshadow the other ones? And with this growth, and we think, great, it was a desert, now there are plants, maybe we can use this for farming now. Well, it's also destroyed diversity. It's also minimizing it's also overshadowing other plants that the fauna might need to use. And John gave a presentation on the types of birds, and there are insects, and there are butterflies, and lots of life that depends on this careful ecosystem. And so any rapid change like this will necessarily lead to cascading consequences. And so we're hoping that this will generate interest, and it's our plan to go to conferences, and when we go to Peru we will talk about this. It's still very new, so in terms of the scientific community, there's been no response yet, but this is normal. I think we need to wait at least 6 months to see articles come out. And then in terms of mainstream news, well, the scientific paper has been picked up. There's been a press release, and there are other news outlets that have been picking this up. There's some debates on Twitter as well.
X.
On X, sorry. X, yes. Yes.
Go ahead. I've already
Yeah.
asked questions. You go.
What's my question? My question was about data. So increasingly there are organizations that are interested in at least recognizing where there are high-risk regions for various reasons, but whether from a government perspective or from a corporate perspective. I'm interested in your view as to what data is and how available the data is to act as an indicator to somebody interested in what's going on. How available is it? Have you found it, or is now at the back of your research, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question, and this is also something that we're thinking of as part of our ongoing project and our collaboration with the university now in Huanta. So as I mentioned, the data set, the MODIS data set is free. It's freely available to anyone. You don't need to be a member of a university. You don't need to be a member of anything to have access to it. Now the issue is that despite it being free, it's not that easy to use. You need to know how to program, and you need to know how to do math, to do data processing on this. And so it's not like anybody could just log into a website, type, I want to know what the vegetation is like in my backyard, and have images like this be generated. This took us 3 years to make a paper like this, and we were a group of 5 researchers. So it's hard to do, but it's our intention so we're working with Peruvian researchers to have local knowledge of this, of how to do this kind of research. And we're sharing our code with them to be able to capacitate the researchers who could then go and interface directly with local communities and try to, as you say, try to predict or monitor the area to see what's happening in more local areas. And then we're also trying to write our code in a way that would be shareable. And so we would only share a program, or maybe even have a website where in the back we've written all the code, and then it would be very easy to click a button and have an image come up. This is a fairly challenging thing to do, so it's not, this won't be done by next week, but it is something that we're constantly keeping in the back of our minds, because the research we do here, the point is not just to have an academic paper and move on to the next project. This actually matters, and we care about it. We've been researching it for a long time, and we would want to see it be used and to actually have people understand it and influence policy with that, or influence their environment.
And in a wider sense, any data the project generates is initially maybe embargoed while we're writing a paper, but once the paper is published, then the university has access to all that data, and is probably publicly available. And let me make one other point.
Paper itself?
No, so basically the data value, that's right. And also when we come to the end of a project, we try and visit communities in the area where we've been working and give them, if they're interested, some feedback. So we did do public presentations, in this case in Alice, Katawasi and Lunawana, so anybody who was interested could come and hear talks about the work we've done.
I think that works at a local level, but at a global corporate level, if you wanted to go down that direction, or global government level, or some other global aspect, I think the challenge is that you can't work with sporadic ad hoc different research and data. So you want ideally the lens of this to be, even if there's gaps in various countries, but the lens and approach to be somewhat standardized somehow, so that there's a universal language about how to look at this.
Yeah, well, we would also want that as well. I think this would be great if we could convince people, so this again is still very new research, but if we could convince people to view this as a standard and share our research and have people come to us to analyze different areas, and then this sporadic nature doesn't have to be so sporadic if the team becomes way more than us five and becomes this global network of universities or global network of researchers covering the whole world and comparing all their data together in as you say, a standardized way.
And there are global standards. Well, I'll talk to you offline maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
going a bit late. In the previous slide, the ISCA and ASCA, would the maritime community be affected by ice melt or lack of betting materials or El Nino, for instance?
So, in terms of causality, it is very difficult to be able to tell that. So, would coastal communities be affected by ice melt? Maybe I would tend to say yes, because the ice is melting, forms a river, the river is big, and so the water makes its way all the way to the community. If the ice is not melting and we're in the dry season, the river dries up and these communities, the river is just dry. And we've seen this many times when we go to valleys and we look at rivers or tributaries. During the wet season, it's flowing, we can analyze the quality of the water, we can do all sorts of calculations. During the dry season, some tributaries are just completely dry. There's not a drop of water in those rivers. So whatever is happening upstream is definitely affecting what is happening downstream. And if we have glaciers that are significantly melting, then we have a continuous supply of water throughout the year, for example. And so this will affect, in a way, the communities that are even up to the coast. Then does that mean that their whole vegetation and agricultural system is dependent on glacial melt? Probably not, because there are other factors than glacial melt that are affecting these communities, and probably some factors more than other. Maybe fog and rain, which affects these areas a lot. And so we have the lomas that are often very foggy. This provides a lot of moisture, and so with or without glacial melt, the lomas are there. But I would say that yes, it's not because a community is on the coast that it is completely unaffected by things happening all the way up the mountain with glacial melt.
Just to pick up on that, since that slide there that I've been working myself for 30 years, and we did this paper you may have seen on Lomas fog and using Moses data the same way. Of course, it's all available on the Google engine.
Yeah.
So you can still, so we provide it all to the government in Peru so they can use the Google engine, they can import it and use it and overlay it with Google Earth. And we constantly saw over the years that the biggest, we were wondering, well, we're seeing it's green as well, and as a general global trend, the CO2 effect is obviously very strong, and warmer seas, more evaporation, that's also strong. But it was extraordinary to see how certain lomas, where when I first was there in the 90s, there were 3,000 sheep, and now there are no goats or sheep, because the big agro-industries have stopped the semi-nomadic movement of huge grazing flocks. We have considered that the way you're presenting it, the scale there, I think it might be a very localized effect, but it is an extraordinary change in the cultural change, that there's no longer these thousands and thousands of migrating goats and sheep, partly because the big agro-industries across the White Coast, they're blocking them, they're stopping getting some of the coastal loma, and also the culture's changing, and those same people that are semi-nomadic goat herders, their kids have got no mobile phone connection, they're not going to be a semi-nomadic goat herder, can't change, and they go on to the cities. So culture is changing at the same time as climate change. I just think it's interesting to have it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the lomas are also a super interesting part of Peru's ecosystems, and I didn't mention this until now with the lomas, because this outline of the greening strip, it doesn't include the lomas because they don't seem to, they've also greened, as you say, but it doesn't seem to be for the same reasons. And perhaps the greening of the lomas is, as you say, a much more generalized culture shift that has allowed them to evolve naturally and to recover from grazing, whereas this greening is different. It's not, it doesn't come from this source.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, it is
Yeah.
a huge trend, but in some ways, you find it slightly reassuring, this greening, because if you think these interglacials, I always like to think that once an ice sheet's gone, you want to have something regenerating. So if it's regenerating, at least there are some seeds there to form that sponging effect and to actually hold the water. So I'll be more worried if there's no greening.
Yeah. So this is the question that a lot of people ask us: is this a good or a bad thing?
Yes,
The greening, and every time we speak to a journalist, this is the question they want us to answer: is this good or bad? And in the academic paper, if you read it, you'll see that it's very dry, and we never take a stance on whether it's good or bad. We just say that this is what's happening. Yeah, we stick to it. Personally, if I veer off from my academic speech, I think it can be both. So obviously increasing CO2 trends, and we hear of this a lot, global warming and greenhouse gases that are creating this feedback effect of more and more warming. I think in a way it's reassuring that naturally the planet is taking care of it. Plants are growing and are absorbing CO2, and it seems like there is a way out of this perpetual growth of CO2 in the atmosphere. That being said, I don't want to be quoted as saying we don't need to worry about CO2 because the planet will take care of it. That's not at all what's happening. And I think we need to be careful as how it's happening and how quickly it's happening. Because as I mentioned, ecosystems are these fragile things. And it's great to see plants absorb CO2. But another organism that absorbs a lot of CO2 are blue algae. And if you have a lake that is covered in blue algae, it's great because it absorbs so much CO2. It also kills everything in the lake, but it absorbs CO2. And so there's some good and some bad. It's great that something is absorbing CO2, but not if it's at the detriment of entire species, for example. If it causes extinctions of thousands of types of butterflies because they no longer have the flowers they need to survive, but it leads to more of one type of plant, I wouldn't say that that's uniformly a good thing. And so I think there is some, I don't want to be purely pessimistic and say that everything is terrible and that any change is terrible, but we have to be careful as to what this implies. And same with glacial melt. So glacial melt provides more water to the area. And when I spoke to a journalist, they said, oh, this is good news, because if that means that that area has more water, maybe local farmers can exploit that and they have more land to make farms. I think, well, okay, that's good news for that farmer maybe on the short term, but what happens when the glacier is fully melted? What then? That glacier is going to keep melting for the next 50 years, so sure, put a farm there, have tons of fruit and sell and make loads of money, but this is a very short-term good news, and we have to be careful as to what we actually consider to be good news here.
Virtually everybody we speak to says in the communities, particularly the older people, they remember ice caps on the mountains. They say it's becoming drier and more erratic, the rainfall. So it does suggest that, as you said, that CO2 is the more dominant factor in determining what's happening. And their concern is that, yeah, there might be a little bit more water from ice melt in the short term, but in general, they're concerned about less rainfall and a more erratic pattern of rainfall.
I just wondered about the history of the project, because there's quite a few Freudian connections with the Flemish tradition, isn't there? And I just wondered if you could tell us how it came out.
Well, maybe John can answer this question.
How it came about? It just came about through some personal connections originally, and that also led to the connection with Moquegua, who were open-minded enough to give it a go and see what could be done. Because we had to see, whether we as a team could work there in the environment, with a group of different projects, with Peruvian counterparts, and that it would work. Also, I suppose, would work financially as well. And that kind of proved that it could work. For certain reasons, we weren't in a position to continue there, but then another university came along, and it's kind of carried on from there, really. There is a Peruvian on the team in the Cavendish, so that helps. And we're all, well, two of us, myself and another colleague, we're long-term involved with Peru. So that also, having that background knowledge, the language, made it possible, because some of these universities have had contacts with other universities in Europe, and it hasn't kind of worked out longer term. But I think the nature of this team means that something has proved to be possible.
There's a soil project.
Sorry?
Some investigation into Peruvian soil.
There is we are doing something now in Huanta, but that's soil related, but very focused on Huanta, in terms of soils. Yeah.
Last one.
Okay, so I'll take one final question, then break.
I think you touched on it earlier, but just to confirm again, maybe, would you expect different results if it was further away from the coastal? I think you said it was further away enough, or away from mountains with mountain glaciers. Would you expect the same kind of level of correlation, for example, between CO2 and green?
Let's see. So the proximity to the coast is, again, climate is a very complicated thing, and so it's hard to say if we were to move the entire Andes away from the coast, would the results be different? Probably, because the whole planet would be different if that were the case. In terms of coast or not coast, so if we really look at the coast, we have these coastal lomas here. And so we can see the coastal lomas are greening. We were having this discussion. I think it's slightly different. It's a different reasoning. Like these two strips of greening are different. This one is the one I concentrated on, and this one is the one I can explain. The lomas, we've looked into it a little bit, but there are intricate factors with human activity. There's a lot of human involvement in the lomas. So is it a climate thing, or is it a cultural thing, or a little bit of both? In this case, it's only a climate thing. It's so big, it cannot be direct human change that has caused this. The lomas, however, it could be purely human, it could be climactic, or it could be a bit of both. It's hard to know which one is the biggest driving factor to what has caused this. So when we talk about the coast, I assume that this is the coast. The lomas up to the foothills is what the coast is. Here, sure, the water is not that far, and it's not like we're looking at the east side of the Andes, but this doesn't really count as coast anymore. This is the western slope of the Andes, but I don't know if it's fair to say that it's coastal at this point. And whatever precipitation comes here from the coast would have come also if we pushed the mountains back by a few hundred kilometers. But again, because it's weather and global trends, it's very hard to say what would happen if we were to reconfigure the mountain range and the tectonic plates. Anything could happen, so I can't give you a clear answer on this, but I think, yeah, there is a difference between coastal greening, then the foothills where there's no greening, and then higher up in the Andes where there is greening again. And I wouldn't call this the coast. Right. Thanks. I guess we can keep chatting. And,
Yeah. Well, in the traditional manner, we always carry on talking once the presentation from the front has ended. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentations this evening, and we hope that perhaps we could return at some point to talk about some other things, but maybe others are also going to reenact or restart this type of Anglo-Peruvian talks and discussions and so on as we had pre-COVID. So thank you very much for coming. Yeah, very good, very good.